We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this morning's Good Systems speaker series. My name is Leah Sabatini, and I'm the program director for Good Systems. If it's your first time joining us, Good Systems is a research grand challenge here at the University of Texas at Austin, and we're focused on designing AI technologies that reflect the needs and values of society. I am pleased to introduce our host this morning, Dr. Peter Stone. Peter is a professor in the Department of Computer Science here at UT Austin and a founding member of Good Systems. Peter leads the Good Systems project, Living and Working with Robots. Peter, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Leah. And thanks everybody for being here. It is my great pleasure to introduce Ben Kuipers, who's a professor of computer science at the University of Michigan. In a former life, he was a professor of computer science here at University of Texas at Austin, and in fact was the chair of the Department of Computer Science in the years immediately before I arrived here. So your term must have ended in around 2001 or so as chair. 2001. Yep. He received his BA from Swarthmore, his PhD from MIT. He's a fellow of AAAI, IEEE, and AAAS. But really, for me, he is was a mentor in my early career. One of the main reasons I came to UT. He was my host when I was a faculty candidate. I often say that when I arrived at UT, there were really just two people working, at the core of robotics, Ben being one of them. And now I serve as director of robotics, where we're up to 14 people who are working in the core of robotics. But really, Ben is the person who one of the people who got our reputation launched as a leader in robotics here at UT Austin, and it was a big loss for us when he moved on to Michigan. He's been a leader not just in robotics, but in the whole artificial intelligence community, and most recently in AI ethics, and that's what he'll be talking about today. So take it away, Ben.
Thank you very much. Let me just work on sharing my screen. Oops, just a moment. I have to, no. I cleared everything else out. Now I have to share this. Okay. Right. There we go. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you guys. And let me take that away. I think I can hide floating.
So it's not showing up on our screen. So whatever it is you're talking about, we okay. Only see your slide.
Okay, that sounds good. All right. Do tell me if there's something that shows up that I ought to get rid of. So ethics, AI raises questions about ethics. And one of the big problems that first confronted me is to try to figure out what the role of ethics is. And eventually it became clear, this may be obvious to everybody else, that ethics is something that helps our society prosper. And of course, we're faced with various challenges having to do with the potential for AI. So we have to ask, what is ethics going to do for us, and can it help solve these problems? Now, just a second. There we go. We've been worried about technology for centuries. So as far back as Socrates, he was worried about the terrible consequences of the written word, saying that it interfered with communication between people, which necessarily, in his mind, involves dialogue. Nowadays, in the time of the large language models, that's actually seeming sort of prescient. I went back and read some of that, and there's something to be said for his position. Now, the printing press, the loom, Charlie Chaplin in Modern Times, the Sorcerer's Apprentice uses magic, but then can't control it. Desk Set is a famous Tracy and Hepburn movie. And of course, I'd say everybody here is familiar with HAL from 2001 and Skynet from Terminator 2. All of these are concerns about the harm that technology might end up doing. And so some of the specific worries about artificial intelligence are whether AI is going to take all of our jobs, and is that going to leave people in terrible situations? Will AI, as it's trained and implemented, will it embody existing human biases against various kinds of minorities? Will it eliminate all of our privacy, tracking us all the time, everywhere? Or like Skynet, will AI take some terrible action based on its own notion of rationality and possibly harm humanity as a whole? So how do we think about these? Are these sort of separable issues? Often when we're reading about them or teaching about them, we have separate units to think about surveillance and fairness and privacy and so forth. Ethics is supposed to help. How? And what is ethics anyway? So my claim is that ethics is a body of knowledge belonging to a society, and it's shared by the members of society, and it's different for different societies, although they overlap a whole lot. Now, let's see, let me try to get backwards this thing. But it seems to be balancing the interests of individuals and societies. I like to tell my students that ethics is actually self-interest. It's often non-obvious self-interest because the short-term benefits for the individual may conflict with the long-term benefits to the society, which then get shared by the individuals. So let's think about how we can look at that. So clearly, individuals decide what to do. And we have the concept of theory of mind that helps say, how is it that individuals decide? Individuals take actions in order to make progress towards their goals in the world as they understand it to be. And that theory of mind is something that children develop at very young ages. We can observe it in some animals. Now, mathematicians have created game theory, which defines rational decision-making, which I actually put in scare quotes because there are ways it can be misused. And of course, it was originally inspired by the concept of recreational games, and one formalizes the interest of particular individuals in terms of a utility function, and then select actions to maximize expected utility, expected discounted utility, in fact. And there's a number of interesting and important concepts that come out of game theory. The first one is at the highest level and is the first one that we're going to exploit here, which is the distinction between positive sum, negative sum, and zero sum games. So let me, So individuals belong to societies, though. That's how individuals decide what to do, but they belong to societies, and they thrive when their society prospers. And society does well when interactions, by and large, are positive sum. That this is every time people interact, each of them does something, and the overall welfare or utility of everybody goes up. And so we typically call these positive sum interactions cooperation. And so it's cooperation that builds resources and for societies and helps a society thrive. Now, the downside of cooperation is that it involves vulnerability. When you're cooperating with others, you're vulnerable to them betraying you or exploiting you. So therefore, because you're being vulnerable, you actually have to trust your partners. Now, trust helps things work out very well as long as your partners are trustworthy. And so what ethics does, this body of knowledge that the society has, is it teaches members of society how to be trustworthy, how to signal to others that you are trustworthy, and how to recognize that others are trustworthy, so as to be able to decide whether to trust them and whether to cooperate with them. So society has a bunch of methods, which we're all quite familiar with, and formal laws and the enforcement of those laws are probably the single most familiar. Social norms and conventions for behavior are also quite familiar. Drive on the right side of the road. That's also embodied in formal laws, but it helps things work well. And there are formal ethical theories and principles, particularly in the body of philosophical ethics called normative ethics. Those are the ways to formalize what ethics does that are convenient to teach people. What we're talking about here might be considered descriptive ethics. That is, what is ethics actually, and how does it help societies? And so a major point here is that evolutionary success for a society comes from this ethics encouraging positive sum outcomes via cooperation and trust, and the question of how well ethics gets transmitted to new generations. Like any evolutionary process, transmitting the information to subsequent generations is absolutely critical. As I mentioned, normative ethics is a set of ways of describing the ethical beliefs and in ways that are convenient to transmit them from one generation to another. And so that transmission is critical for success. So putting several of these things together, it seems clear that we start with our ethical principles, which tell us how to be trustworthy, which encourages trust. Trust encourages cooperation, which produces positive sum outcomes. And trust also encourages various social norms, which save a lot of resources because you can count on other people to follow those norms. And both of those together add more resources to the society. There's a fair amount of evidence from the study of human evolution that the increasing amount of cooperation among people and within groups and across groups has contributed in a major way to human cooperation, to the evolution of human society. So as I mentioned, theory of mind is an important cognitive capability that we share with some animals, and it allows one to predict what another individual is likely to do. And that's very helpful whether you're predator or prey. But humans, and evidently not very many, if any, animals, evolved what theorists call joint intentionality roughly 400,000 years ago, which is the cognitive creation of a virtual agent that we might call we, and pairwise coordination towards the goals of that virtual agent to accomplish some joint goal. And about 100,000 years ago, that got generalized to collective intentionality, where the virtual we represents the entire group. Now, cooperation, as cooperation spreads, the society is able to acquire more resources, and we acquire knowledge and skills, and society grows and thrives. I'm drawing here particularly on the work of Michael Tomasello, who for many decades has worked on this issue of joint and collective intentionality, and John Henrik, Joseph Henrik, who has looked at the accumulation of knowledge over cultural evolution. This picture of the development of large-scale societies, I first picked up from Robert Wright's book on called Non-Zero, which I would encourage you to take a look at. As with many kinds of evolution, a continuing theme is death. That is, individuals and societies able to encourage cooperation tended to thrive and have more resources, and those who didn't and were not able to cooperate didn't thrive and often became extinct. Now, here we are. One of the problems people like to think about when thinking about AI are existential threats. But we've been facing existential threats for a long time, and nuclear war is certainly still an existential threat for the human race. Global pandemics. We had a relatively mild one with COVID. It could get a lot worse. We're facing climate change. Now, when we look at these existential threats, I tend to worry a whole lot more than I do about the existential threats from AI, machine learning, and robotics. But it's worth thinking about those ones too. One of the things that we know about that is that responding to these various threats is necessarily going to require global cooperation. And that's going to require trust and trustworthiness. And when one looks around, it's a little unclear how well we're fixed to do that. And our evolutionary existence may well depend on how well we can do that. So it's worth understanding the dynamics of this process. So what I've just described is what I would call the big picture. That is, how does ethics help us succeed through helping our society succeed? Including, what's at stake with these existential threats? Now, I recently published a paper called Trust and Cooperation that outlines many of these aspects, but my thinking is continuing to develop on that. So now what I want to do is to move on to what I'll call the small picture. That is, this is instead of the macro view, we're going to take the micro view. What should we actually do? So what problems do we actually want to solve? And unfortunately, I don't have a complete recipe. I'd love to do that, but there seems to be years and decades more work to do. So clearly, when we're worried about situations, we're worried about people making decisions. And those decisions might have different outcomes with different utilities. And so in the simplest case, here we're in a situation wondering what we should do. There's going to be a choice point, and we have two alternatives. Now, in fact, in the real world, we may have a continuous space of alternatives, but for simplicity, let's imagine that it's just two. What should we do? Well, given this very, very simple view of the world, then obviously what we ought to do is do the best one. We can choose the greater good, or if these are bad alternatives, choose the lesser harm. And so if we imagine we have a utility function that we can define over those states, if one utility is better than the other, then you do that. Otherwise, you do the other one, which is more so. Now, sometimes these choices are hard. And so perhaps you don't get too much sympathy, but if A and B are both fabulous, it's a tough choice where you have choices between great alternatives. Do you go to the university? Do you stay at the University of Texas? Do you go to the University of Michigan? Diverging futures, tough choice. Both of them, both options were great. But there are plenty of situations where both A and B are terrible, in which case we get what I call a deadly dilemma. And it's clear those choices can be heartbreaking. They can be just awful. So people thinking about autonomous vehicles have taken that class of problems and created what I originally called the deadly dilemma, which is you have an autonomous car that's zooming along a very narrow road, and all of a sudden a pedestrian appears and you have two choices. You can either continue on and kill the pedestrian, or you can crash into a barrier and kill the passenger. And so there was a very popular and very large-scale online game called The Moral Machine that presented this to millions and millions of people around the world, and to find out which they would choose given information about the demographics of the potential victims. And so this is presented as an ethical dilemma for autonomous vehicles. The people who present this say, well, this should stand in as an example problem. For those of you who look even a little bit at the philosophical background of this, this is a version of the trolley problem, and I expect all of you are familiar with that. We won't say anything more about trolley problems. The difficulty here is that we have two choices, and they're both wrong. They're both bad. There are situations where you have no choice. That is, or you have this choice, but you are faced with two terrible things, and you have to decide what to do. But I'm claiming this is not one of them. This is a situation where we can actually avoid this deadly dilemma by looking for an upstream decision point where there's a different decision to be made, and making the better decision avoids both of those cases. Now, in fact, this has been well known for practically forever, and we teach it as part of the skill of driving. And if such an upstream decision point exists, and it doesn't always, then failure to act properly at that decision point is considered negligence, and you become at fault for facing this deadly dilemma, not for what your choice is. So you're traveling along at some speed, you turn into a narrow road. What are you supposed to do? We teach every 15 and 16-year-old what to do. You slow down. That if you stay going fast, when the pedestrian appears, you may find yourself with a deadly dilemma. But if you go slow, the pedestrian appears, you slam on the brakes, and you stop safely. So that says this is not the ethical decision that one is facing. Who do you kill? The ethical decision was to detect this upstream decision point and make the correct choice there, where you could avoid this deadly dilemma entirely. So that's saying I don't want to assess the utility of killing the pedestrian versus killing the passenger. I want to assess the utility of facing that choice versus not facing that choice. And so it's very clear that once you face that choice, your utility is terrible. So this has a far lower utility than this one, and you know which branch to take. Now, people often say, well, if you're facing a deadly dilemma, you can't go back in time and make and make that choice over again. You're stuck. You have to make it. You have to make a real decision. But time travel is not impossible for a teacher or a student. You have to anticipate the deadly dilemma. And maybe you learn from a near miss experience or from somebody else's terrible experience. And what the ethical thing to do in that situation is to search for and learn about an upstream decision point and figure out what to do. So ethics, from the point of view of this type of decision, is a skill, and it's learned from experience, and it's practiced through experience. This is something Aristotle said. Aristotle said that ethics is a skill just like carpentry. You get better at it through practice. And in case you want to show off to somebody, phronesis is a Greek word that he used to mean practical wisdom. And when you have that kind of practical wisdom, the tough choices are fewer. Life gets better. You don't face deadly dilemmas, or at least you face fewer of them. So this is two pieces of the ethical puzzle that we need. When making choices, you want to do the most good or the least harm, and that's basically what philosophers call utilitarianism. But you also need, when facing a difficult decision, a deadly dilemma, you need to find an upstream decision point and do the right thing there, even before the dilemma appears. And this actually is pretty similar to what philosophers talk about as deontology, or rules for making decisions. Now, there's a third piece of this puzzle I want to spend some time on. We use models to think about the world because the world is infinitely complex. In order to reason about this world, we need to use simplified models. What is a model? See, we are scientists and engineers, and so we know we have to use models all the time. They make explicit a few aspects of the world, and they leave everything else out as negligible. The things they make explicit, you might call the known unknowns. The stuff that's omitted are the unknown unknowns. And as was pointed out by Rumsfeld, I believe it was, Secretary of Defense, it's the unknown unknowns that can really bite you. And so if you neglect important aspects of the world when creating your model, then you can do perfectly adequate reasoning and it will give you terrible results. So now let's look at the prisoner's dilemma. This is the single most common and favorite example from game theory. Now I'm formulating this not in terms of prisoners, but in terms of cooperating for rewards, just because the numbers work out better that way. But it also applies in case you're talking about years in jail. So two players have the opportunity to work together for rewards. If you and your partner both cooperate, you each get a reward of 3. Are we talking $3, 3 gold bars? Doesn't matter. I mean, this is the structure. But if your partner is trying to cooperate with you and you defect, you can exploit your partner. You get 5 and your partner gets 0. So you have an opportunity to throw your partner under the bus and get a big win. But if you both defect, then you both get 1. This is obviously a problem. Now, everybody has seen this before, and if whatever your partner does, defect is your best choice. So if you calculate the utility of defecting, then that's what happens. So if your partner is going to cooperate, you might get 3, you might get 5. You get 5 if you defect. If your partner is going to defect, you might get 0, you might get 1, but you do better by defecting. So you defect. But your partner faces a symmetrical choice. And so your partner is also going to defect, and you end up getting the worst outcome. It's the worst outcome for society as a whole because the collective reward is only 2, whereas it could have been 5 or 6. And it's a bad outcome for you as an individual because you only get 1. It would have been easy to get 3. You might have held out the hope for getting 5, but that was a pipe dream. So why do you get such a bad outcome? Anybody looking at this sees that the cooperative solution is better, but it requires trust. And it requires trustworthiness. You have to have both of those. And the model we put together, the way we formulated the utility function, said that utility is the reward, is the gold bars or the dollars. And so trust and trustworthiness were not included in the model. Now, it turns out if you run an experiment with humans and have humans play the game, they consider alternate models, they make better choices. A particularly interesting fact, though, is that somebody decided to analyze how humans did, and these were undergraduates, of course, according to their majors. And they discovered almost all of them did better than the utility maximization that's described by game theory, except for majors in business and economics. And by the time they had been majors in business and economics for multiple years, they made bad choices. So if you omit trust from the model, then utility maximization exploits vulnerability. Trust is lost, society loses. So this is a third piece of the ethical puzzle here. That is, if the model is too simple, then you follow the math and rational decisions lead to bad outcomes. And so in order to think about that, we need to recognize that trust and trustworthiness are important in order to achieve cooperation, and that they can often be left out of these models. And so we have to ask ourselves, what do we need to trust? How am I vulnerable? How am I open to exploitation? What social norms would prevent that exploitation? And how would we want to sanction norm violators? So now let me move into the last bit here. When people are looking at common problems in AI ethics, there's often these particular issues. I mean, I spend a couple of weeks on each of these in my ethics class. How do we ensure that autonomous agents make safe decisions? What do we do about ubiquitous surveillance and the need for privacy, or maybe privacy is gone? How do we achieve fairness and prevent bias? How do we worry about jobs and economic inequality? So now the question is, does the framework that we're developing help us approach some of these? So in order to make safe decisions, there's a popular approach to this, which is called value alignment. Let's go and see if we can set up our AIs so that they have values that correspond with the values of people. Now, there are technical difficulties with actually getting that right, like deciding whose values they are, but it's an interesting approach. It seems to me that in many cases, the problem is not so much value alignment as situational awareness. A lot of problems come up because the model is too simple. Significant hazards are left out of the model and are therefore invisible to the decision maker. So the decision maker can make what they think is the right action, and it has major harmful consequences. So the hypothesis here is that if an AI has an adequate model of the situation, it's not going to be terribly difficult to decide what the right action is. So in order to make sure that the decisions of an AI are trustworthy, we need to audit its situational awareness and determine whether there are important hazards that are invisible to the model that it's using for decisions. Now, a lot of people know that Tesla had a significant problem with self-driving Teslas crashing into emergency vehicles that stopped on roads. Those vehicles were effectively invisible to the decision maker, and therefore it crashed into the road. It wasn't a value problem. It was a situational awareness problem. A lot of people encounter difficulties with surveillance and privacy. Many websites are creepy. They appear to be omniscient about what you want, what you're interested in. I actually, at one point, I looked up what the actual definition of creepy means. And the best definition I found is sensing the potential for future harm. Creepy doesn't mean there's harm today. It means that it's revealed the potential for future harm. And a lot of that comes from a phenomenon that is often called surveillance capitalism. Social networks and search engines collect a huge amount of data about your interests. That's valuable, especially to advertisers and to data brokers who aggregate it, analyze it, and sell it to advertisers. We all know Bayesian methods for aggregating lots of weak data to create very strong models of individuals. The value of this data has led social networks and search engines to work to maximize engagement. And sometimes that involves creating outrage and polarization in the society, not because they're interested in creating polarization, but because they want to maximize engagement to make more money. So what do we want to trust in that situation? We want to trust that our data is used responsibly and that our privacy is protected. Lots of these places claim to protect our privacy. Do they? Hard to tell. How should we adequately do regulation and enforcement in this domain? Of course, there are a lot of decision support systems that use data models of various kinds for a lot of different applications. But how do I trust that I am considered by these decision systems as an individual and not simply as a member of a category? There may even be some negative characterizations that is correct, that it's not incorrect bias, but it's correct bias, but it doesn't apply to me as an individual. So then I am being treated unfairly. And so there are a number of specific ways that people analyze that and difficulties that we encounter. And there's an awful lot of interesting research attempting to ameliorate these problems. We're not there yet. One of the big concerns is that the possibility that automation is going to eliminate a huge number of jobs. Now, one thing, there's huge amounts of data showing that automation is creating more wealth for the society. So the wealth accumulation has been continuing along a pretty consistent path. The difficulty is that it's eliminating jobs. Now, the problem with eliminating jobs is partly that it's eliminating the pay for those jobs, but it's also that it can eliminate meaningful work. Now, there are plenty of jobs that are valuable for a good society. We already create jobs like teaching in public schools, working in a fire department, working on national defense of various kinds. These are jobs that are subsidized by the society in order to make our quality of life better. There are also a whole bunch of care jobs, childcare, elder care, healthcare, environment care, and so on, that are often underpaid. They are, the individuals who do it are underpaid. They're often overworked. That is, there's not enough people for the need. And the cost is too high. If it's to turn a profit, the cost is too high for the people who need those services to pay it. So they can't be profit centers. And so if we think about how jobs are typically created in our economy, they're created when they create profits. And these jobs are valuable for the society, but they don't create profits. So therefore, they need to be subsidized. We have the money, we have the jobs, we have the people. The problem is, can we use some of that wealth to create good jobs to support people in a good society? So people need work, society needs resources. This is how we provide meaningful work. Market-based entrepreneurial processes are valuable, but we want to know whether we can use those processes in order to create these kinds of jobs, and even though they need to be subsidized. So we need mechanisms. Now, an example of such a market-based entrepreneurial process is, for example, the National Science Foundation. That is, we have a process that can subsidize certain kinds of work, and people have to compete to get that. How do we generalize that notion in order to create the kinds of jobs that will give us a good society? That's turned out to be harder than people had hoped. And so here's an example of an oversimplified model, just as bad, maybe worse, than the one we saw in The Prisoner's Dilemma, with wildly destructive consequences. Milton Friedman published a paper entitled "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits," published in the New York Times Magazine in 1970. Very, very persuasive, very influential. A lot of people loved this. If you go through that paper in detail, it is deeply deceptive and irresponsible. Milton Friedman is a brilliant man, won a Nobel Prize, undoubtedly deserves it. And he uses that genius for what I can only say are evil ends. So what have we accomplished in this talk? What I've tried to do is to put trust and trustworthiness at the center of our consideration of ethics and AI. And what ethics is doing is teaching us how to be trustworthy, how to demonstrate that we are trustworthy, and how to recognize it in others. And so when we need to make action decisions and build more extensive plans, we want to make sure that our model includes the things that are actually important, because it's easy to make oversimplified models that omit important things. We want to maximize the good, minimize the harm, obviously, but only if you've included the actual components of good and harm in the model. And we need to look for these upstream decision points in order to find out how to maximize, avoid terrible dilemmas. So finally, whoops, deep. Trustworthiness, and cooperation are central to the success of our society. And so I've laid out 3 pieces of the puzzle of ethics. There may very well be more. And then we need to apply these principles in a variety of contexts in order to come up with specific choices of action. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ben, for the talk. We have, I guess, everybody here. I encourage you. We have about 13 minutes or so for questions. Feel free to turn on your camera and speak out. So I think Sam has done that, but perhaps has a question. And also feel free to type questions into the chat if that's what you prefer, and I'll moderate that way. Sam, do you have a question?
Well, I'm working on formulating it. Thanks. So such a stimulating talk, and there's so many familiar ideas like the prisoner's dilemma or the versions of the trolley problem presented in to me in novel contexts that really made me think, and I really appreciated that. The question I wanted to ask is about collective intention, and sometimes I think about intention in relation to what we might call in the Rumsfeld model unknown knowns, things that are out there that actually have directionality and content that we don't know, and often intentions, I think, get buried, right? Somebody had an intention once and it got distributed elsewhere in society, or maybe into an object, and we no longer know that we know something in that regard. And I kind of thought you were going to go with AI there because of the problem of aligning, our manifest conscious intentions now with maybe older intentions that got, programmed into an AI once upon a time, right? Or that an AI was developed that could have them. So how do you think about collective, or do you think that collective intention is something we can describe having between people and non-human entities? And if you do think that's possible, what happens? Is that one of the instances where alignment actually becomes more difficult than one would think?
Yeah. Well, let me recommend, this is the book by Michael Tomasello called Becoming Human, where he's talking about the development of first joint and then collective intentionality. Now, intentionality is a sort of fairly deep and subtle concept, and it's more than just what your intention is. But it seems to revolve around this notion of theory of mind, that agents will do what they can to approach their goals, given the world that they see it. And just like F equals MA, this is one of those relations between several concepts where if you know 2 of those 3 things, then you can infer the third. And often you observe one, you assume a second, and that lets you infer the third, and then you bootstrap that farther on. The notion, so the individual intentionality says, if I observe you doing something and I assume that we see the same world, then that tells me something about your goal. And then if I know your goal and I can observe your world, I can predict what is likely to be your next action. Now, joint intentionality says you and I can then create an agent we that has a goal, And then each of us does our share of the actions that are necessary to move in that direction. And collective intentionality sort of says our whole community may have a goal, and we may infer that goal from our community's actions. Now, part of the point that Tomasello is making is that the ability to do that, the cognitive ability to do that, was an evolutionary achievement. And so at a certain point in time, if you were able to join forces with a partner, you might be able to capture prey that was much bigger than you would be able to do alone. And so you would both be more likely to survive and be a more likely partner, enabling you to have reproductive success. And so if you happen to be an otherwise admirable person at that time who didn't have that capability, you might be abandoned to just try to cope on your own, and you would be outcompeted with those who were able to cooperate. And so your future was much more bleak.
So I was going to ask, actually related to that, do you happen to recall, Ben, what was the evidence that Tomasello had that 400,000 years ago this capability of appeared, and then 100,000 years ago it generalized to greater than 2?
Yeah, well, part of there were various things that happened, and about 400,000 years ago, apparently there was a significant climate change, and food became more scarce. And so the need for joint intentionality became necessary, because in order to gather enough food in order to survive, you needed to be able to work with others. And there are some kinds of evidence in, but let me refer you to the book to get the details.
Yeah.
That according to the spear points and nets and things like this, that would help you infer that the hunting was being done by groups instead of by individuals. 100,000 years ago, there was humans had succeeded enough that there was a real population explosion. And part of the problem was that particular groups, in order to succeed, needed to cooperate and be able to organize for both food capture and production, and for defense or quite possibly offense, which required larger scale cooperation. And again, I think he's pulling together evidence from the record that's been preserved that long, to say there's evidence of people being able to do that.
Okay. I'll just, we do have a question in the chat from Bo Chap. Said, I don't know if you, I'll read it out loud if you want to look at it as well. He said, great presentation. Piggybacking off that answer, do you believe it may be more difficult to understand the worldview of an AI than a human's, consequently making it difficult to increase trustworthiness, especially given that we don't always know the full process behind an AI's given output?
Yeah. Well, it certainly is potentially more difficult to understand the worldview of an AI. And I would raise a question: to what extent would you say that a current state-of-the-art AI like ChatGPT or GPT-4 or some of its competitors even has a worldview? That is, we have certain aspects of worldviews that we use to organize the various bits of knowledge that we have and to draw various kinds of inferences. It's not at all clear that these large language models have anything similar to that. And this would be a a topic that we need to do significant research on to see whether what the role of a worldview is in being able to do larger scale inference, and whether these models have that.
Okay, thank you. Bo, I don't know if you have any follow-up with that. Yeah, he says thank you. So good. Are there any other questions that people would like to ask themselves or in the chat? So I have another question, Ben. So to the extent that ethics is about building trust and trustworthiness, then what does that say about whether the extent to which there's sort of a quote correct code of ethics? Are there multiple, right? So are there multiple stable points in this space? And then who is it? Who are we to judge the ethics of a different society? Or is there or can there be better codes of ethics than others? Other than, I mean, you've said that you can evaluate them to the extent that they encourage the actions that are good for the whole. But if you have two codes of ethics that lead to that same benefit for the whole, are they therefore equally good?
Good question. In some sense, now it is very clear that different societies have different codes of ethics. And this is particularly dramatic when we look over historical time. So once upon a time, there were societies for which it was not only ethical, but prudent to sacrifice the fruit of your youth to the volcano gods in order to hold off the possibility of volcano eruptions. As time went by, it became clearer and clearer that that was not a worthwhile thing to do. And human sacrifice is now, I believe, extinct. Slavery is another institution that was accepted for the vast majority of human history. And over the last few centuries, it has become completely unacceptable. Unfortunately, I'm not optimistic enough to say that it's extinct. But at least I believe the people who continue to practice it know they're doing something that's widely disapproved of. So you have to put effort into not getting caught.
Sure. So is that like widespread disapproval a direct correlate of it being not as stable for generating actions that are for the collective good, or is it some extra different, or is it some different sort of process that makes it seem repugnant?
Well, that's that's an interesting question. I would say the value of ethics is partly the practical ability to encourage cooperation and more resources, but it's also partly to create a successful story that you can pass on to your descendants that says this is how we should behave. And so evolution depends on both of those, the ability to transmit this information. And when you're talking about transmitting ideas, the overall acceptability and coherence of those ideas is important. I see that Lewis has his hand up.
Yeah, and also let me check. Al, you turned your camera on first. Al, did you have a question or?
Oh, okay. Right. Hi, Ben. How are you?
Hi, Al. Nice to see you.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm not sure if the LLM have even the notion of truth, not to speak goodness. Okay, right. So what do you think about that? What is truth?
Oh, what is truth?
I mean, I use the ChatGPT, right? I mean, does it really know what truth is?
No, I don't believe so. It's on the other hand, there are sort of consensus opinions consensus positions in the training set that it works with.
But that's very dangerous, right?
I don't think it has any particular notion of truth.
Okay, we live in a Nazi society, right? So I mean, then they accept that it's acceptable. It's true that Hitler is a god. Okay, right? I mean,
I would not count on a large language model to be able to make those discriminations at all. I'd say, and that may well tell us something about the inadequacies of the current state of the art in large language models.
So maybe Peter can tell us something about this, okay? Because I think that there is a trend, okay, to have to train models for specific kind of subfields.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So what if someone evil use Hitler, okay, writings or whatever to train the model, okay, that to do various things.
It is a possibility.
Yeah, I think let's and now we can talk about it offline too. I'd be happy to. Maybe let's take one more question and then close off. Luis, you had your hand up as well.
Yes, Ben, nice to see you. Wonderful talk.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too. The way I see and one of the reasons I'm in robotics and automation and its connection to AI is because I believe it promises to provide surplus for everyone, and pushing an agenda for development of these technologies. It's important to me with this larger than life goals, sort of.
Yeah.
But it looks like our institutions, and I do have in general a trust of our institutions, whether they are national or community based, but of course they have their faults. But nonetheless, institutions seem to be insufficient to distribute collective goods when they are produced by these systems that potentially they could make them incredibly affordable. So the question here is is there a solution that the models could solve in that sense of, do you see a path where actually institutions provided by computational models could eventually be able to distribute better collective goods, and what is you see a path for that, and what things need to happen for this kind of technology to take place?
Yes, I do, and I think there is a prospect for that. That's why I put together this three-part picture that says automation and various and our technologies are in fact increasing the wealth of our society. And there are plenty of work to be done that would be both meaningful and would increase the welfare of all of the people in the society. And there are plenty of people who I think would want to do that work. The problem is that we have structured our society around certain, and particularly our economy, around certain ideas that make it difficult to interface those three components the way they need to be interfaced in order to accomplish those goals. And I pick on Milton Friedman because he's a particularly attractive poster child for this position that I criticize. And I think that a good example of an oversimplified model that has largely taken over the economy is that the function of corporations is to increase profits. And therefore, anything else is a distraction. And so I actually have an argument. It's mostly in PowerPoint right now because I present it to my students when I assign them to read that paper. But if you critique that position, he's being seriously intellectually dishonest about it. But I think it's been a very attractive position for many people in the economy, many people in business, and they are now seeing how an excessive focus on profits, particularly short-term profits, is leading to make decisions that have long-term very negative consequences. So I think I think that there are solutions. I think that we can even figure out to some extent what those solutions are. But whether we will actually adopt those solutions remains to be seen.
Ben, just to follow up, it would be great if you have references of writings. I would love to read about that. I preach. I co-founded a company. I preach that the goal of the company is to open the door and see the employees grow, and not grow in an economic sense, but in an intellectual, creative sense, right? But that's still only for the employees, right? So I would like to see the wider spectrum for the collective. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I wish I had more concrete solutions to that.
So
Craig Wheeler asks, will AI recognize the golden rule? I hope so. I think if you were to create super intelligent AGI, one would hope that it would recognize the value of the golden rule. Anyway, over to you,
yes.
Peter.
So yes, good. So we've already gone a little over time. So thanks everybody for being here. Thanks, Ben, for the very interesting presentation and the discussion following. And if everybody here who's not already a part of Good Systems, if you'd like to learn more, I invite you to come to the website. And I think a few of us from the Good Systems team will hang back and talk to you for a little bit more, Ben, if that's all right.
That's fine. Thank you.